In 1971, Philip Zimbardo locked 24 college students in a fake prison beneath Stanford University. Within 6 days, the guards turned sadistic. The prisoners had emotional breakdowns, and the world learned what it believed was its darkest lesson about human nature, that any ordinary person given a uniform and authority will become a monster. That experiment is taught in every psychology textbook on Earth, every intro psych class, every country. It shaped criminal justice policy, military training doctrine, and how we think about Abu Ghraib. But recently, researchers gained access to Zimbardo's private archives, original audio recordings, handwritten notes, internal correspondence between the research team. What they found isn't a minor correction. It's a complete demolition. Here's the version you probably learned. August 1971, Stanford University. Philip Zimbardo recruits 24 young men through a newspaper ad offering $15 a day. He randomly assigns them as guards or prisoners in a simulated prison built in the basement of Jordan Hall. The guards receive khaki uniforms and mirrored sunglasses. No specific training. No instructions on how to treat the prisoners. The prisoners get smocks, ankle chains, and ID numbers instead of names. And within 36 hours, the guards spontaneously begin imposing sadistic punishments. Strip searches, sleep deprivation, forced push-ups, psychological humiliation. The prisoners start to psychologically unravel. One has a breakdown so severe he must be released on day 2. The experiment, planned for 2 weeks, is shut down after just 6 because things spiral completely out of control. The conclusion enters the permanent record of human knowledge. Situational power corrupts. Put anyone in authority and the darkness comes out. It's clean. It's terrifying. It's one of the most elegant demonstrations in the history of behavioral science, and almost none of it happened the way you were told. For decades, nobody seriously questioned the Stanford Prison Experiment. It was psychology's foundational myth, too powerful, too useful, too perfectly dramatic to interrogate. Then in 2018, a French academic named Thibault Letexier did something no one had bothered to do in 47 years. He traveled to Stanford and requested access to Zimbardo's original research materials. Hundreds of documents, audio recordings, typed memos, handwritten margin notes, internal correspondence between Zimbardo and his research assistants. Letexier spent months going through every single box. What he found was so damning that he published an entire book about it, Histoire d'un mensonge, which translates to History of a Lie. Around the same time, journalist Ben Blum independently tracked down the original participants and conducted extensive interviews. Their accounts of what actually happened in that basement didn't match the textbook version, not remotely. But here's what makes this even more unsettling. None of this evidence was hidden. It had been sitting in Stanford's archives for nearly half a century, available to any researcher who requested it. For 47 years, almost nobody asked. The textbook version says the guards quickly descended into cruelty, that the transformation was almost immediate. The archive recordings tell a completely different story. On day 1, the atmosphere in the basement of Jordan Hall was closer to a college dorm than a prison. The guards were awkward, uncertain. Several tried making small talk with the prisoners. Multiple guards later reported feeling genuinely confused about what they were supposed to be doing because Zimbardo's instructions had been deliberately vague. They'd been told to maintain order, but nobody was being disorderly. One guard, interviewed decades later by Ben Blum, described the first day as simply boring. "We were just standing around," he said. "Nothing was happening." This is critical because the entire scientific thesis of the experiment depends on the claim that authority spontaneously and inevitably corrupts. But on day 1, authority did absolutely nothing. The guards didn't snap into cruelty. They stood around in their khaki shirts waiting for something to happen. And when nothing did, the research team decided to make something happen. This is where the official story starts to collapse. Among the archival recordings Letexier uncovered was an audio tape, and this tape changes everything. It captures David Jaffe, one of Zimbardo's undergraduate research assistants, explicitly coaching a guard on how to be tougher. The guard in question had been too passive, too friendly with the prisoners. And on this recording, you can hear Jaffe telling him that the research team needed him to act more aggressively. He didn't hint. He didn't suggest. He gave specific instructions about what kind of behavior the experimenters were looking for. When this tape surfaced publicly, it detonated the experiment's central scientific claim that the guards' cruelty was spontaneous and emergent. It wasn't emergent, it was directed. But Jaffe wasn't freelancing. He was following a plan. In Zimbardo's own archived notes, There are explicit references to wanting the guards to create a psychological atmosphere of oppression and powerlessness among the prisoners. The experiment wasn't passively observing what happens when you give ordinary people authority. It was actively engineering a predetermined outcome and then calling it natural human behavior. That's not science. That's theater direction with a research grant. Now we come to the single most iconic moment of the entire experiment, the scene replayed in every documentary, printed in every textbook, referenced in every retelling for 50 years. Prisoner 8612, a student named Douglas Corpy. On day 2, Corpy appears to suffer a complete psychological breakdown. He screams. He sobs uncontrollably. He bangs on the walls and begs to be released. It's the experiment's emotional centerpiece, the undeniable proof that this simulated prison was so psychologically devastating that it shattered a healthy young man in under 48 hours. Except Douglas Corpy eventually told the truth. In a 2017 interview with Ben Blum, Corpy admitted that his breakdown was, in his own words, a good acting job. He wanted out of the experiment. Not because he was psychologically shattered, but because he had a graduate school entrance exam to study for. When the researchers initially refused to release him, he escalated. He performed a breakdown because performing was the only thing that worked. Corpy was explicit about it. Anybody who is a clinician would know that I was faking, he said. He later added, I'm not entirely sure whether I was experiencing real distress or just performing it very well, but the line got blurry. The single most powerful image from the Stanford Prison Experiment, the moment that convinced the world authority destroys people, was a performance by a graduate student who needed to study for a test. Here's a detail that somehow gets glossed over in every textbook account, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Philip Zimbardo was not a detached, neutral observer in this experiment. He didn't watch from behind a one-way mirror taking careful notes. He inserted himself directly into the simulation as the prison superintendent. He wore the role. He made active decisions about how the prison operated day by day, hour by hour. Consider what this means for scientific integrity. The person who designed the experiment, who held the hypothesis, who had career incentives tied to a specific outcome, that person was also an active participant inside the scenario meant to test that hypothesis objectively. When guards were too lenient, Zimbardo's team nudged them toward cruelty. When prisoners wanted to leave, and several asked, Zimbardo, in character as superintendent, pressured them to stay. Then in 2005, Carlo Prescott broke his long silence. Prescott was an ex-convict who had served as the experiment's prison consultant, and he wrote in the Stanford Daily that many of the prison's most oppressive features, the degradation rituals, the identity-stripping procedures, the arbitrary punishments, hadn't emerged organically from the guards at all. They were Prescott's own suggestions, drawn from his real prison experience, deliberately implemented by the research team from the very first day. The cruelty had an author, and it wasn't the guards. Here's something the standard narrative almost never mentions, and the omission itself is revealing. Most of the guards were not cruel. Of the 11 guards in the experiment, researchers typically categorize only about 1/3 as exhibiting genuinely abusive behavior. Several guards were actively kind to the prisoners throughout the entire 6 days. One guard, referred to in the records simply as the good guard, consistently refused to punish prisoners, did small favors for them, and tried to make the experience less unpleasant whenever he could. In interviews years later, multiple guards expressed real frustration and disbelief about how the experiment was presented to the public. They didn't recognize their own experience in Zimbardo's telling. The guards who behaved decently were simply edited out of the narrative because they contradicted the thesis. But think about what their existence means scientifically. If the experiment's conclusion is that situations override individual character, that the prison environment inevitably transforms people into oppressors, then guards who resisted that environment are devastating counter-evidence. Their very existence disproves the central claim. Zimbardo had this data from the beginning. He always had it. He chose not to emphasize it. Because a finding that says some people are cruel when encouraged and some aren't doesn't become the most famous experiment in the history of psychology. It doesn't make the cover of Time magazine, and it doesn't build a 50-year career. In real science, a landmark finding needs to be replicable. Other researchers should be able to run a similar experiment and get similar results. With the Stanford Prison Experiment, that hasn't happened. In 2002, the BBC partnered with psychologists Alex Haslam and Steve Reicher to conduct a televised partial replication. Their results were dramatically different. The guards did not become tyrannical. The prisoners actually organized, resisted, and at one point overthrew the guard system entirely. The inevitable power dynamics that Zimbardo described simply did not emerge. Haslam and Riker concluded that people don't automatically become oppressors when given authority. Tyranny requires active identification with a role, a sense of shared group identity, and critically, encouragement and direction from leadership. It requires someone telling you to be cruel. Sound familiar? Beyond the BBC study, no major replication has ever independently confirmed Zimbardo's central thesis. The most frequently cited demonstration of how situations corrupt individuals in the entire history of behavioral science has never been successfully reproduced by another research team. In any other branch of science, that alone would be disqualifying. In psychology, it somehow remained the discipline's most taught experiment for over 4 decades. If the evidence against the Stanford Prison Experiment is this overwhelming, the coaching tapes, the faked breakdown, the unreplicable results, the experimenter contamination, then why is it still taught in virtually every introductory psychology course on the planet? The answer has 3 layers, and none of them are flattering. First, it's a spectacular story. It has narrative arc, dramatic escalation, and a clear moral. Textbook publishers know that an intro psych class needs content that holds the attention of 18-year-olds, and guards spontaneously turned evil in a basement is vastly more compelling than a researcher systematically manipulated conditions to produce predetermined outcomes. Second, the underlying framework isn't entirely wrong. The situationist perspective, that context and environment shape behavior more than we like to admit, has legitimate support from other research. Milgram's obedience studies, despite their own methodological controversies, offer much stronger evidence for situational influence on behavior. But Zimbardo's version was always the more dramatic, more filmable, more quotable demonstration. And third, this is the uncomfortable part, there's institutional inertia. Zimbardo spent decades as one of the most prominent and politically connected psychologists alive. He served as president of the American Psychological Association. He testified before Congress. He consulted on Abu Ghraib. Challenging his signature experiment meant challenging the field's entire power structure. Most academics quietly decided it wasn't worth the fight. Strip away the mythology, and the Stanford Prison Experiment still teaches us something profound, just not what Zimbardo intended. It teaches us how desperately we want simple explanations for complex human behavior. We want to believe that evil is purely situational, because if the situation made them do it, then nobody is really responsible. The guard was a product of the environment. The prison system made him cruel. It's a comforting framework, because it implies that under the right conditions, anyone would do the same, and therefore no individual is truly accountable. But the actual evidence from Zimbardo's own archives tells a harder story. Cruelty doesn't spontaneously emerge from a uniform and a set of keys. It requires encouragement, direction, and explicit permission from authority figures. The guards who were cruel had been coached toward cruelty. The prisoner who broke down was performing. The experiment, designed to reveal a dark truth about human nature, instead revealed something equally dark about how science itself can be manipulated to tell whatever story the researcher wants to tell. And maybe that's the real lesson worth teaching in every psychology class on Earth. Not that power inevitably corrupts, but that we should be profoundly skeptical of any finding that produces results too dramatic, too clean, and too perfectly aligned with what the person running the experiment set out to prove. The Stanford Prison Experiment isn't really a lesson about prisons or authority or human darkness. It's a lesson about stories, about how a compelling narrative can override 5 decades of counter-evidence, and how the institutions we trust to find truth can sometimes be the most invested in protecting a lie. If this changed how you think about what you were taught, subscribe. We break down the psychological research and behavioral science that shaped the modern world, and whether it actually holds up under scrutiny. Drop a comment. Were you taught the Stanford Prison Experiment in school? And knowing what you know now, do you believe the textbook version or the tapes?